Good morning, all. The church bells welcomed us at noon. I want to begin with a combination of welcome and thanks, and those activities, welcoming and thanking, are in fact interconnected. I want to welcome everyone who is here, everyone who is on Zoom. I welcome you to this talk in celebration of the history of St. Jude's Chapel. We have here today and on Zoom online, we have members of St. Michael's, we have neighbors, we have Open House New York visitors, we have Park West Village residents and historians. So this is a group with many different interests that comes together for the purpose of thinking about St. Jude's as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the consecration of the chapel in 1921. Many thanks are due to many people for making this lecture possible, and also the events over the next week or so, during which we will be celebrating St. Jude's Day, culminating with a special service next week. The St. Jude's Planning Committee has been working extraordinarily hard, and in all that we do on that committee, we have the really remarkable support of clergy, vestry, and congregation, for which we on the Planning Committee and I personally am tremendously grateful. And I especially want to express thanks to our former rector, George Brandt, who was the first one to invite me to be archivist here, and who encouraged me in the study of our truly remarkable archival collection, which among other things contains most of the records of St. Jude's, the largest such collection of any chapel of its kind within the Episcopal Diocese of New York, and in fact in the Northeast. So I thank finally all colleagues and historians, church colleagues, secular historians. We all work together, especially in putting together the story, the history of something like St. Jude's Chapel, where we grab insights from so many different kinds of sources. We depend on each other in conversation and sharing of insights to put together a coherent picture. So this talk does honor the people of St. Jude's, and I hope that by the end of it, we will be in a position amongst ourselves in conversation and then in reflection as the week goes on, to think carefully and responsibly and humbly about issues of race in our church. So on your first slide, you see the title of this talk, but more important, you see the St. Jude's stone, which is located in Park West Village on the actual site of St. Jude's Chapel, 19 West 99th Street. For those of you who know nothing about St. Jude's, the absolute 15-second version is that St. Michael's Church ran from 1909 until 1957 a so-called colored chapel along the lines of Plessy versus Ferguson's separate but equal. And it is a story of great dignity and victory in terms of how remarkable that chapel was, and tremendous shame in terms of how the chapel was created and then destroyed. So that's in large part what this is about. Let me give you a sense of place, first of all. The Bromley Maps, which are available in a wide number of libraries, were critical for insurance purposes and policing purposes primarily. I've chosen a 1927 Bromley map. I realize that you can't particularly see it. Up top is 101st Street. Down at the bottom is 97th Street. And to the right is what we now call Central Park West. And to the left is Amsterdam. So if you look at the portion of the map, if you go to the far right and see where it says sections, just above where it says sections, you see Block 1835. That's what I've blown up for you. You'll be able to see some of these slides after this talk. You can see St. Jude's Chapel located at 19 West 99th Street, sort of catty corner to Reconstruction Hospital, which was the only hospital for African Americans for major plastic surgery. And you can also tell from the Bromley Maps the width of the building. St. Jude's Chapel was 25 feet wide. That was it. It was small. So that's the location, together with a couple of pictures from the 20s and 30s of St. Michael's itself. I'd like to tell you about Florida Howard, one of the really extraordinary lights of this community in the 20th century. What you're looking at is a 1952 picture of a wedding within St. Jude's Chapel, and Florida Howard by then is looking fairly old, and he's the officiant. He is very light-skinned. He was African American, but he is very light-skinned, and throughout government records, he's often referred to as white, sometimes as mulatto, colored, or Negro, and there's a long history of light skin in his family. I've been able to find out a little bit more than I knew last time I spoke to the congregation about St. Jude's, about Florida Howard's family, and I'll show you briefly about that now. I've been able to trace back to his paternal grandfather, who was a free man, a laborer in Maryland. He signed up with the colored troops for the Army in 1863 for the Union Army. He got in some sort of a scuffle being away without leave, and there's some question involving clothing and a knapsack, but there was a hearing and he was exonerated. And then, I don't know how, but he was wounded and he did die in the Colored Hospital in Baltimore in 1865, just a few days before the end of the war. His widow, Rebecca, who was a seamstress, had several children by him. She did draw a pension from the Army. She moved to Philadelphia and lived the rest of her long life with her oldest child, who was named Florida, who was our Florida Howard's father. He was a caterer and married to a school teacher. They were listed there in subsequent writings about the family. They're called middle class. I'm not sure that that's accurate. Florida, the caterer, and Rebecca, the seamstress, had several children, among them our Florida Howard, and a couple of brothers and two sisters, May, a sculptress, and Harriet, who would marry Florida's classmate in seminary. And this is important because when Florida Howard did go to seminary, he went to Bishop Payne's Seminary, which was the prominent seminary for, according to their mission, young Negroes of promise in Virginia. And his sister married John Johnson. Ultimately, they would move here to New York, and the two brothers-in-law, Florida Howard at St. Jude's, and John Johnson, who became the vicar at St. Cyprian's, ran the two biggest so-called colored chapels in the Episcopal Diocese of New York, and you'll hear more about John Johnson later. St. Cyprian's, incidentally, was located right where the Metropolitan Opera House of Lincoln Center now is. Lincoln Center was its own kind of urban renewal project, and St. Cyprian's was located there. Florida Howard married a school teacher, and they had several children, twins who did not live beyond infancy, and then adult boys. The whole family was involved in the administration of St. Jude's Chapel, and it became part of the feature of St. Jude's Chapel that whole families were involved. That was part of the nature of the chapel, that it was a family chapel. St. Jude's originated as a sort of roving project in rented spaces on 91st Street. And it was originally administered from the cathedral, and then St. Michael's took over. And in 1920, after the death of one of St. Michael's most prominent parishioners, a tremendously wealthy woman, the vestry of St. Michael's, in a great flush of courage, decided to take a good deal of the Zimmerman money and build a permanent chapel on 99th Street. They had already been renting space at 19 West 99th Street, but they were going to tear down that rickety old wooden building and instead build a permanent structure. And they chose the firm of Ludlow and Peabody, a distinguished firm. These are some of the best known buildings. Many of you may be familiar with 10 East 40th Street, a particularly handsome 1929 building, or the Saratoga Springs Visitor Center, which is on the National Register of Historic Places, as is this church. It was no mean thing for the St. Michael's Vestry to commit to Ludlow and Peabody for what would be St. Jude's Chapel, and this is St. Jude's Chapel. I show you this because it came out in the American Architect magazine soon after the building was finished, and it was touted as a premier example of its kind. It is tremendously handsome, and I have found out only in the last 2 or 3 months that there may be a whole cache of photographs of the interior, which we don't have, that I may be able to gain access to sometime in the next 6 months or so. I'm very excited, so cross your fingers about that. This is the Certificate of Consecration, and if you want to see the thing in the flesh, it is in fact hanging in the back of the church there to the right of the St. Jude's altar. And I'd like to tell you what the consecration of the chapel was like. And I'm reading here from the Messenger, the St. Michael's Messenger. On Tuesday morning, May 24th at 10:30, this is a description of Consecration Week in 1921. St. Jude's Chapel was consecrated by Bishop Manning, who declared it to be the most complete building of the kind he had ever seen. The consecration week opened with confirmation on Trinity Sunday night. Bishop Hulse of Cuba confirmed 19 girls and women and 18 boys and men. 413 people were crowded into the chapel in some way, and fully as many were turned away. The Reverend McCandless, who was then the rector here at St. Michael's, was present at the service. Several of the class had been Baptists, Moravians, Presbyterians, and Methodists. One woman who was confirmed had never been attached to any denomination before. The consecration service is one that will never be forgotten. He goes on to list, this is Florida Howard, goes on to list the various dignitaries that were there and clergy, and then concludes with this additional description. Dr. Peters, who was the rector emeritus at that point of St. Michael's, under whose leadership the vestry had decided to build St. Jude's Chapel, one of the truly distinguished clergymen of the early 20th century in this country. St. Michael's rector gave a sketch of the history of St. Jude's and its relationship to St. Michael's. But what was most deeply interested to the audience was his fair, impartial, and kindly interpretation of the race problem of the United States and the godly counsel given as to the manner in which it should be solved. Oh, that we had that sermon to know what that thinking was. He alluded to the fact that St. Michael's had done her share in bringing about the solution by the kind of building that had been erected for St. Jude's. Bishop Manning also made a brief address in which he stated that he had only been a bishop for 6-8 weeks, in which he stated that his first baptism had been 2 little colored children. His first confirmation had been that of a class of colored people at St. David's Mission, and now his first congregation was that of a colored chapel. After the service, the bishop and the clergy and the invited guests were served at luncheon by the women of our chapel. Thus closed our week of consecration. The inspiration gained from the many visitors who came to us will be helpful in meeting and accomplishing the work that we have to do among the 4,000 colored people of West 99th Street. St. Jude's was serving the 4,000 colored people of West 99th Street who were not welcome at St. Michael's. We get a good deal of our information from the monthly Messenger. The Messenger ran from 1894 to 1942 when St. Michael's ran out of money and couldn't publish it anymore. St. Jude's typically had 2 to 3 columns in monthly issues that were 8, 12, or 16 pages long. So it certainly wasn't very much space, but enables us to learn a good deal about life in the chapel. The columns were irregular throughout the 20s, but they become very regular in the 30s and in the 40s. And one of the first events that is reported on with great drama is the dedication of the altar. For those of you who don't know, the altar in question is the altar at the back of the church, the white altar, which was in the chapel, installed in the chapel, as a memorial to John Pinette Peters in 1929. And after St. Jude's was torn down in 1957, the altar went into storage, and St. Michael's reconsecrated it and refurbished it as part of our bicentennial in 2007. You begin to get a sense here of the place of St. Michael's in the community at large, because you see here a picture of John Pinette Peters and an article from the New York Age, one of the great black newspapers of the United States, indicating that the altar is going to be dedicated. This was at the beginning of March in 1929. This was a great source of irritation, by the way, to St. Michael's, because St. Michael's had not yet gathered up enough money to fund a memorial to John Pinette Peters. St. Jude's beat them to it, and St. Michael's was not unirritated about that. The New York Age reported on the altar's dedication on the 9th of March. The headline was, "Impressive Services Mark Ceremony of Office of Dedication of Marble Altar, Memorial to Dr. John Peters." The Right Reverend Herbert Shipman, suffragan bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of New York, dedicated a white marble altar on Sunday as a memorial to Reverend Dr. John Pinette Peters. Never was a more impressive service held in St. Jude's Chapel when, before an overflowing audience, the memory of Dr. Peters was honored by more than 2 hours of music and eulogy. The office of dedication was rendered by Bishop Shipman, who made a touching address pointing out that John Pinette Peters had been his own father's best friend. He said, "The ideal of what a rector should be is held before us in the person of Dr. Peters." And Thomas McCandless then said, Thomas McCandless, the then rector of St. Michael's, said, "This altar is a living memory of Dr. Peters." The cost of the altar was pointed out. It was $3,000, commissioned from the Lamb Company. And the writer of the article noted that St. Jude's was never at a loss for using any occasion for fundraising, and so the occasion of the dedication of the altar was used as a fundraiser for choir vestments and a red aisle runner. The fundraising initiative was run by Mrs. Fields. You'll hear that name again later, and $500 was raised on that day. So I want to spend some time giving you a sense of who came before that altar, who came to St. Jude's, who were the people who came to the people of St. Jude's. Because Florida Howard saw to it that St. Jude's became the center of a series of connections among political, economic, social, cultural leaders, both lay and clergy, throughout the Northeast. And the events at St. Jude's were reported on regularly. So I want to highlight 3 clergy people who were frequent visitors at St. Jude's. Robert Bagnall was a Bishop Payne man, that is to say, a student at Bishop Payne Seminary. He was ordained a deacon in 1938. He did serve in several churches. He was briefly curate here in New York at St. Philip's. But he was drawn to community organizing, and he became a leader in the NAACP, first in Detroit, then Chicago, then New York, and then assuming national leadership before his retirement to lead St. Thomas, the first African-American church in the country in Philadelphia. Robert Bagnall was a frequent visitor to St. Jude's, preaching, lecturing, also being a master of ceremonies at various parties and events. Edgar C. Young, the man in the middle there, I don't know when he died. I simply haven't found out the date of his death yet. That's why the question mark. He's the dark-skinned black man standing right to the right of the door there. He was the vicar at Phillips Brooks Memorial Chapel in Philadelphia. He and Florida Howard were particularly close friends, and they would take each other's chapels during the summertime, calling it vacation, although in fact they were doing a good deal of preaching. The piece on the top of the photograph there is an invitation to the 25th anniversary of Young's ordination, and the principal officiant there for that service is John Johnson, who would be a member of Florida Howard and John Johnson's clergy family here in New York. This is a comment from, in fact, the New York Times. At the services held on last Sunday, the Reverend Edgar C. Young of Phillips Brooks Memorial Chapel, Philadelphia, conducted them instead of the vicar, Reverend Florida Howard, at St. Jude's, who still is enjoying his annual vacation. Dr. Young is one of the most scholarly and forceful preachers in the ministry of the Episcopal Church, and many have been helped spiritually by his ministrations here for the last 3 Sundays. Sunday, September 9th, will be his last day of ministry among us. He will conduct the services at 8, 11, and 8 p.m. That was a typical Sunday at St. Jude's. The picture on the right is Thomas W.S. Logan, and I find him particularly moving, and when I found this picture of him, I was so delighted. Florida Howard went to Bishop Payne Seminary in a fairly full class, a graduating class in 1904, and one of his classmates was Thomas W.S. Logan Sr. And they would remain close friends, and Florida Howard became a mentor to Thomas W.S. Logan Jr. And there was a good deal of publicity about Logan Jr. in 2011 and 2012, because at that time, and I'm reading here from a speech that was written in honor of him, he was the oldest serving African-American priest in the Episcopal Church. He had been much written up because he was the first African-American to be on the board of Union Theological Seminary, and he was a major leader throughout the church, whom Florida Howard mentored. Father Logan has also served the church in a number of other leadership roles, including delegate to the Anglican Conference of Cape Town, South Africa, member of the Restitution Fund Commission, past president of the Homeless Fund, member of the Diocesan Council, a founder of the National Conference of Black Episcopalians, past president of the National Church Workers Conference of USA, founder of the National Conference of Black Episcopalians, member of the Brotherhood of St. Andrew, and a life member and founder of the Union of Black Episcopalians. His movement from being the child of a Bishop Payne priest to being a priest who, in fact, himself went to General Theological Seminary and Union Theological Seminary represents a shift at St. Jude's from a Bishop Payne focus to a focus of connections and influence throughout the Episcopal Church. And at Lenten lectures and services, which were a particularly important time for education at St. Jude's, Florida Howard invited over 100 priests from all around the country to come and talk and teach and preach. And they were increasingly from General and from Union, representing the movement of admission of young men of color to those seminaries by the middle of the century. In addition to clergy preachers, there were also visitors of significant influence. I chose just a couple. Fred Moore was the editor of the New York Age, a very prominent journalist and activist. He was born into slavery, and by 1910, he was an owner of the New York Age and a co-founder of the National Urban League. This drawing, which is housed in the National Archives, is by Charles Alston, a St. Jude's boy. Joseph Douglas was a violinist. He was the grandson of abolitionist Frederick Douglass and a frequent performer at St. Jude's. Two other fairly frequent visitors were William Robert Valentine and Reverend Imes. William Robert Valentine was something of a firebrand. He was an early Harvard graduate. He graduated in 1904, and in 1914, he was appointed principal of the State Industrial and Agricultural School of New Jersey. And John Dewey took note of him, writing, "His labor and influence have been felt in every direction, and he has made many friends among white as well as colored people." He spoke frequently about educational matters at St. Jude's. Reverend Imes I included with visitors rather than clergy because he was a Presbyterian, and he therefore did not preach or deliver communion at St. Jude's, but he was a frequent visitor. Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. Was a close friend of his and wrote about him. He was the minister of one of the largest Black Presbyterian churches in the country, St. James Presbyterian at 141st and St. Nicholas. Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. wrote about him, "His is the mind of a scholar, the soul of a saint, the heart of a brother, the tongue of a prophet, and the hand of a militant." So these were the kinds of people who came to St. Jude's to talk to the community in educational presentations, in Lenten series, throughout the year, but especially during Lent. I'm going to tell you about a couple of people of St. Jude's, particularly well-known people. Aubrey Gittins was a leader at Harlem Hospital. He was a radiologist with a specialty in pulmonological diseases. He, in an AMA article entitled "The Centennial History of African Americans in Radiology," published in 1995, was listed as being the first board-certified radiologist in the Caribbean. It's important to notice here that much of the population of St. Jude's was, in fact, from the Caribbean. This was a largely Anglican in ancestry population. You see here, this is a picture of Aubrey Gittins giving a chest x-ray with a new x-ray machine to the Manhattan Borough president, also important as an African American. And Gittins will come up again as someone who gave tremendously generously in terms of his money. Earl Richardson is a poignant figure. He was a very young man at his death. And we first hear about him in 1932, when Florida Howard wrote in the Messenger that he couldn't be at one event that was particularly important because he needed to attend a meeting at the Art Center, 65 East 56th Street, prior to the opening at that place of the Negro Art Exhibit under the auspices of the Harmon Foundation and the National Alliance of Art and Industry. Among the winning New York artists was one of our own young men, baptized and confirmed in St. Jude's Chapel, and always a regular attendant, Earl Wilton Richardson, who was awarded $75, the Allen Benmont Portrait Prize for his profile of a Negro girl. He has studied at the National Academy of Design, where he won some poster contests. This young man will give an exhibit of his work in our parish rooms sometime in the near future. We don't know whether that happened or not. He did die young. This is material that comes from the Smithsonian's presentation of some WPA art. As a young artist in Harlem, Richardson showed great promise. He studied at the National Academy of Design. He won the Harmon Foundation Prize. As the executive director of the Harmon Foundation at the time explained, after being shown in New York, these shows traveled throughout the United States to show outstanding creativity as an approach to better interracial, intercultural understanding. In 1934, Richardson and Malvin Gray Johnson, another significant WPA artist, older than Richardson, a veteran. He had been a Harlem hellfighter, but also a Harlem man. Richardson and Johnson planned a public works of art project entitled Negro Achievement for a Harlem Library. They completed studies honoring Benjamin Banneker, Toussaint Louverture, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Nat Turner, and others, but in November 1934, Johnson died suddenly, and Richardson died the following year without completing the project. Another scholar is more explicit about his death. He was only 22 when he was commissioned by the WPA to achieve the work with fellow African-American artist Melvin Gray Johnson. However, Johnson died unexpectedly of illness in late 1934. They were a couple, and severe depression over his partner's death led Richardson to suicide in early 1935. The New York Times discreetly puts it there, as you can see to the right. He was unmarried, but that was, in fact, the story. And the funeral was indeed at St. Jude's. Do you remember Mrs. Fields, who did the fundraising on vestments at the time of the consecration of the altar? She was part of a huge Fields family. I haven't been able to straighten out the mother, the sisters, the which husbands, numbers of children. But one of the prominent Fields was a young man named Frank Gaskin Fields. He's the third person from the left in the 1954 picture there. He became a quite prominent composer, and Florida Howard mentions each time in the Messenger, each time he won a composition prize when he was a student at Columbia. He won some Columbia prizes, he won a World's Fair prize, and then he became passionately involved in this series of plays that culminated in a sort of operetta concerning Sacco and Vanzetti. And the critic of the Times wrote, "There is an almost continuous flow of music which is inventive, melodious, and occasionally soaring, that states the case for understanding more succinctly than prose." Once again, a St. Jude's boy. Many of you who know about the history of dance will probably know and recognize the name Joe Nash. Joe Nash was a St. Jude's boy. What we first hear about him is that he was a crusader. The Crusaders Club was a club that he and some of his friends put together. You had to be 12 or 13 or 14 boys. Crusaders were boys. And their sole mission was to repair toys. They were crafty lads, and they repaired toys. He went on to become a dancer, as you can see. Was then engaged in World War II, where he had training as a secretary primarily in Europe. And he then became a well-known Christian educator. He was on the program staff of the National Council of Churches, and he was the founder of the Ecumenical Black and Multicultural Christian Education Center. And the people at the National Council of Churches sort of knew that he was interested in dance, but they had no idea that he had had an extraordinary career as a dancer and choreographer and then teacher. And in the dance world, they didn't know all that much about him as an educator. When he did retire, which was in the mid-50s, when he retired from the Council of Churches, which was in the mid-50s, he then allied himself with Alvin Ailey and was on their initial faculty and was their historian and whatnot. And he was interviewed in 1999, and I'd like to read you what he wrote about St. Jude's. He said, "I grew up in a highly diverse community of people on the Upper West Side in New York City." He did, in fact, live about 5 doors down from St. Jude's on 99th Street. "There was a little Protestant Episcopal church near us on West 99th Street called St. Jude's Chapel. As a youngster, my parents enrolled us in this church. St. Jude's was the center of my life as a youngster. Here I experienced arts-steeped religious activities, serving as an acolyte in that wonderful ancient liturgy. I loved donning the special robes. I loved singing the old chants and hymns in the children's choir. I even taught Sunday school at the age of 9. When the teacher didn't show up, they just said, 'Joe, take over the class.' I was introduced to Bible studies and to many persons of deep conviction who would talk about their life experiences in relation to their faith. I participated in our outdoor processions and in the Passions, and because I had the ability to memorize long passages, I was always up there performing. That was my foundation, a dramatic introduction to the Bible, a community of deep faith, to liturgical music, and to art as a dimension of faith." This is, the picture on the left is a picture of him lecturing on dance at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. The wonderful picture on the right is of him teaching and rehearsing the inspired Donald McHale's dance called Games, which was premiered at Hunter College in 1951. I love that photograph because of its absolutely, astonishingly grace-filled authority. It's a very moving, I find it a very moving photograph. So those were the kinds of people that visited St. Jude's, were at St. Jude's, emerged from St. Jude's. St. Jude's was chronicled in the Harlem newspapers and in the New Age. Weddings, funerals, parties, processions, pageants, they were all there. And the accounts of them are extraordinarily vivid and exciting. Two fun examples: St. Jude's to hold 15th annual reunion at the Alhambra Ballroom. For those of you who like to rent out ballrooms, you can still rent out the Alhambra Ballroom. 25 years in the priesthood to be celebrated. And then there's a long description of everyone who talked, what happened on that day, what people ate, what they sang. So the question is, what happened? All of this activity, all of this vitality and this joy. There begins to be in the messenger a tone, a shift in tone to something that combines triumph and exhaustion. In 1936, around the 15th anniversary of the dedication of the cathedral, Florida Howard writes, "We recall with interest the presence of Bishop Manning at the service here 15 years ago. The people were happy upon obtaining such a commodious church home and have during these years added a beautiful memorial altar to Dr. Peters. The old altar," in other words, they got a new altar. What did they do with the old altar? "The old altar now standing in the city mortuary chapel. A pipe organ and other furnishings have also been added, the latest addition of gifts being 4 colored windows by Dr. Aubrey Gittins. Those windows long gone. Had it not been for the drift of colored populations to Harlem, where several churches have been constructed for them, our chapel would have been inadequate in size long ago. As it is, every available portion of space is daily utilized. On special occasions, our chapel is far too small for congregations, although suitable for ordinary demands. All concede that the condition of our neighborhood would be desperate without St. Jude's." In 1940, Florida Howard writes, "Had it not been for St. Jude's Chapel, our neighborhood would be unlivable for decent people. I say this without any fear of contradiction. Our present building is not far from 20 years old. It has been used continuously. Being of solid concrete, it has stood the wear and tear. We see now that it would have been greatly to our advantage had the seating capacity of the chapel been larger, or the guild hall been more commodious, or the day nursery more fitted to the present requirements of the Board of Health. However, we are grateful for what we never dreamed of having 30 years ago, and we do take every advantage of all our facilities." And there, the record, at least from the messenger's point of view, dies, because this is the time when St. Michael's ran out of funding for the messenger. And by the early 1950s, dramatic change is afoot in the neighborhood. Robert Moses is beginning to plan for the building of what would be called Manhattan Town. Ultimately, it was called Park West Village. This complicated package of state and federal funding that involved essentially destroying the neighborhood in order to build something new. There was a kind of radical and unspeakable cynicism in the assertion that the people who lived there would be better if they could go someplace else. They would, in fact, be better off. Florida Howard in the New Age in 1954 expresses some optimism. You'll notice the headline, "St. Jude's is 99th Street landmark. Merger with St. Michael's likely." Florida Howard wanted that. He wanted the neighborhood not to be destroyed. He wanted St. Jude's and St. Michael's to merge. It was not to be. St. Michael's legal energy was not invested in preserving St. Jude's. St. Michael's legal energy was invested in upping the price for the sale of the building and the land in order to get as much as possible for St. Michael's. I want to read to you the final letter that the then rector of St. Michael's, William Quirker, wrote to the people of St. Jude's. "Dear member of," this is the text on your right, "Dear member of St. Jude's Chapel, the rector, wardens, and vestrymen of St. Michael's Church believe that the work at St. Jude's Chapel cannot be continued when the Reverend Florida Howard retires January 1st, 1957. He begged not to be retired." After consultation with the vicar and the bishop, it has been decided to close St. Jude's Chapel, December 30th, 1956. Your residence having changed from the parish area, we suggest that you find an Episcopal church in your neighborhood and that you attend divine services there. For your convenience, a list of parishes in your neighborhood is enclosed, and I am sure that you will find from this list a church near to you where you can worship. The members of St. Jude's Chapel who remain in this parish area are being transferred to St. Michael's membership. If I can be of any help to you in deepening your loyalty to the church and in furthering your understanding of our goodwill as we make these changes, please call upon me. Not a word of thanks for Floarda Howard's 50 years of service and accomplishment. Once again, the members of St. Jude's Chapel who remain in this parish area are being transferred to St. Michael's membership. This was what remained. This is a still from a remarkable documentary by a journalist and documentarian whom some of us met during our bicentennial named Jim Epstein, called The Tragedy of Urban Renewal. This is a young man standing in front of the area which is what is now Park West Village. As people often comment, it looks like a war zone. So if you're still living there, you may come to St. Michael's. This is a deeply sad story. First, it is sad because it is such a pure story of the fallacies of separate but equal. Second, it is sad because of the easy contempt with which St. Jude's was destroyed, and St. Michael's was complicit in that destruction. Floarda Howard was always spirit-filled and optimistic. He said in 1914, "We are slowly building up a center of civic righteousness, and the work done counts for the kingdom of God." He often talked about building. We have a banner out on our bell tower now that quotes from the letter of St. Jude, "Build yourselves up on your most holy faith." So it seems to me to be clear that St. Jude's was a center of civic righteousness. It seems to me there's absolutely no doubt about that. But what do we make of this assertion that the work done counts for the kingdom of God? How do we reread and re-understand that 1914 statement about the work done counts for the kingdom of God in light of 1958 and the destruction of St. Jude's? It does seem to me that the work being done for the kingdom of God is clear for the members of St. Jude's, that the daily work of the chapel was an absolute affirmation for the members of St. Jude's of their personal identity as God's children, as participants in and contributors to the divine creation of goodness. The more complicated question for those of us who are descended from those who were complicit in separate but equal and the contempt-filled destruction of St. Jude's is, what does this notion of the work done counting for the kingdom of God mean for us white people who honor the people of St. Jude's? I suggest that this work done for the kingdom of God that they did constitutes an open and generous invitation to us to enter again into our baptismal covenant, and to know that this covenant is not just about relationships between individuals and their God, but about how faith operates in community. The history of St. Jude's, I believe, invites us to, in the language of the baptismal covenant, strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. And I do hope that we answer this positively, saying, yes, we do try to do that with God's help. I believe that we do that when we remember and celebrate St. Jude's, when we express our gratitude to St. Jude's for their leadership in our diocese, and when we respond to their invitation with willingness to try to be worthy of it. And I believe that events like this and next Sunday's service are part of that celebration and part of that response to the invitation to renew our baptismal covenant. And I thank you all for listening to all this about St. Jude's and to these thoughts about it, and I invite any questions that you have. Those of you who are here from Open House New York may have heard more about a chapel whose art and architecture you can't see than you anticipated. So I encourage you to read the packets of material that describe this building, to wander around and to look at it, but it is very much part of our history, and the altar does embody that. So, are there any questions in general? If not, I will let you go. You have been astonishingly patient, and I will be here to answer other questions. Yes, screech out your question, and then I'll repeat it again.
I never fully understood the difference, and I suspect it's profound, between a chapel and a church, and particularly in this context with St. Jude.
In this context, the distinction between chapel and church is a matter of governance. Here in this church, we have a vestry which calls to it a priest or priests to be our rectors. In chapels, sometimes called mission chapels, there is more immediate oversight not from a vestry, but from another church entity, typically a cathedral, or in the case of St. Jude's, it was St. Michael's Church. Mission chapels do not have vestries. They do have important congregational bodies that contribute to decision-making, but they're not formal vestries as such, and the priest in charge is typically called a vicar or priest in charge rather than a rector. Yes, is that Wynn behind the mask? I'm so glad to see you.
I just want to add to the wonderful presentation you have made and the writings you have done about the history of both St. Michael's and St. Jude's, that in the public library on 100th Street, we have a neighborhood collection which has a lot of your material and material from the old community that lived there. And you're welcome to, it's right at the entrance, and you're welcome to use it. It's called the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Collection. And anybody, and anytime during the library hours, you can use it in the library. And there is, Jeannie, as you know, but others may not, a pamphlet that St. Jude's published, about what we are doing, we, St. Jude's, are doing, which is a wonderful, gives you the sense that you have given when talking about what they are doing. But the spirit comes through. You don't read it as a history because it was an ongoing thing at the time. So anyway, I just wanted you to know if you want to build on some of the things, build with or behind some of the things that Jeannie Terepka has presented this morning. It's an open neighborhood history collection.
The shortest version of what Wynne has just presented for you is that at our Bloomingdale branch of the library on 100th Street, there is a superb collection of neighborhood history materials that includes some of this material, and she, as someone who's been a vital contributor to that collection and to Park West Village's own sense of itself, encourages you to take advantage of that collection and that material. Any other general questions? I don't want to keep you. I will. Let's say, in fact, we will officially conclude here, which just means that I'll move away from the microphone and down here, but I would love to keep on talking. And once again, I thank you so very much for being here and for participating in Thoughts about St. Jude's.